So my name is Robert Baines. Hello. I am the President and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, a charitable NGO devoted to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. This is something that most Canadians do not have to think about on a daily basis, and that is precisely because we have built up our security over many decades and a lot of effort. So it's incumbent upon all of us to remember that and to be informed about all of the various issues that are facing us across the globe, and to remember that Canada is not an island. We are connected, and we should be, to make sure that we can thrive and help others to thrive. So today, we're really very pleased to talk about the OSCE, another integral part of the rules-based international order, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But I did want to invite all of those who are watching to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, NATO Canada, and all the rest of our, shall we say, our infrastructure of social media on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, so that you can be part of the conversation again and again. With that, I would like to introduce our two wonderful moderators, Eric Jackson and Edwette Sharma. They are both interns and program editors at the NATO Association of Canada. Gentlemen, please take it away to introduce our outstanding guest.
Thank you very much, Robert. As you mentioned, my name is Edwette Sharma. I'm a research analyst and ambassador coordinator at the NATO Association. And yes, we are a not-for-profit organization aimed at educating Canadians on the value of peace and importance of security.
And hello, my name is Eric Jackson. I am the program editor for Canada's NATO at the NATO Association, as well as ambassador coordinator. We are honored today to be joined by Her Excellency, Ambassador Jocelyn Kinnear, Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ambassador.
If I may begin with a brief introduction. So Ambassador Kinnear joined Foreign Affairs Canada in 2004. She was most recently the director of the Export Controls Policy Division, where she led Canada's accession to the UN Arms Trade Treaty. She has also served as deputy director in the Office of the Deputy Minister for International Trade, as senior policy advisor on Eastern European security files, and as the head of corporate governance unit. Overseas, she has served in Ethiopia from 2007 to 2009, and at the permanent mission to the United Nations in New York in 2005. At headquarters, the ambassador has also worked on the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, as well as international security files. She holds an honors BA in Linguistics from the University of Toronto, an MA in German Literature from Queen's University, and an MPA in Public Policy and Administration from Carleton University. After that stellar introduction, Ambassador, we invite you to begin with some opening remarks before I pass it on to my colleague, Eric, to take it away with the questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Edwette and Robert and Eric for your very kind introduction. I thought what I would do today is maybe presuming that some of the audience may be less familiar with the OSCE than some other organizations. I thought I would walk us through a bit the structure and a little bit of the history of the OSCE and what it brings to sort of the broader rules-based international order, and so I have a short deck that I'll walk us through on that, and then I thought we could talk a little bit about I can talk a little bit about Canada's priorities here, as well as some of the partnerships we engage in here. So with that, maybe I'll just kick it off on the deck. So the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is, I mean, the title sort of tells you quite a bit. It is intended to increase cooperation. So there are, as you can see on this slide, 57 participating states with a population of well over a billion. Really, as you can see there, it's kind of pretty much the entire northern hemisphere of the world sits around this table. And it has I'll also mention just that it has a very high tempo of meetings. We meet at the ambassador level, we meet once a week on Thursdays. We pretty much meet all day on Thursdays because there's a lot that we get to talk about every week. And of course, that's the permanent council, we call that. And then there are meetings of various at other levels, at various collections of experts, etc. So, you know, on average, we have probably about a dozen meetings a week that we're doing with our very lean and mean delegation here of 4 diplomats and a military advisor and a program coordinator. So that's just a bit of a sense of the inclusiveness, I think, of the organization. 57 states all sitting around the table talking to each other. If we can maybe go to the next slide. So what is the OSCE? You know, I think the mission statement can tell us a lot. It works for stability, prosperity, and democracy through political dialogue about shared values, and effective programming. I think that really sort of sums up the key elements that the OSCE that comprise the OSCE. It's a regional security arrangement that is essentially an extension of affiliated with the UN to the extent that it's recognized under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter. And it's a really, it's intended as an instrument for early warning, for conflict prevention and risk reduction. Again, all through dialogue and some programming, for crisis management, and for post-conflict rehabilitation. If we can maybe move on to the next slide. So this all goes, all stems from the Helsinki Final Act, and I wanted to just walk you through a little bit of the history of OSCE, because it is quite an amazing feat that it came together in 1975. So at the height of the Cold War, it was created originally as the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and it was signed on at that point by 35 heads of state, with Prime Minister Trudeau. Pierre Elliott was there for Canada. It was the era of Gerald Ford, and it was the era of the USSR, and Leonid Brezhnev was signing on behalf of the USSR. These countries, despite obviously at that point in time such a tense environment, in a Cold War environment, sat down and committed themselves to a set of principles that are principles that we stand by today, that are fundamental and important principles that underpin, in Canada's view, everything that the rules-based international order should really be. And they not only committed to these principles, they committed to engage in dialogue about them. So it was really a watershed moment, almost 46 years ago. Obviously a lot has happened since then. But as I'll speak to on the next slide, it's a vision of a comprehensive vision of security, where not only do you have hard security, but human rights, what we call the human dimension here at the OSCE, and also economic and environmental security. All of these things need to come together and be discussed in order to ensure our broader security across the OSCE region. Maybe with that, we'll go on to the next slide. So the Helsinki Decalogue. The Helsinki Final Act, the document that was signed in 1975, included what is referred to as the Decalogue of Principles. And I'd invite you just to sort of read over these. These are critical principles that I think 45 years later, we look at these, which remain our commitments at the OSCE. And they're fundamentally important commitments and principles for Canada and we hope all of our partners at the OSCE to uphold. Just to pick out a few: sovereign equality of states. All states are equal and sovereign. Refraining from threat or use of force. Very important, comes up regularly in our discussions. The inviolability of borders. Very important, and linked, of course, to territorial integrity. Peaceful settlement of disputes, again, linking back to non-use of force. non-intervention in internal affairs. Again, linking back to sovereignty. So you can see that these are kind of mutually reinforcing in many ways. Respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. This is a critical one for Canada. I mean, all of these are critical, of course, for Canada. Equal rights and self-determination of peoples. As you can imagine, territorial integrity sometimes bumps up against self-determination of peoples. That can make for some complicated and nuanced conversations, which is important. For which it's really important to have a forum where you can have a dialogue about that. Cooperation among states, of course, and fulfillment in good faith of obligations under international law. So all of these are high-minded and important principles, not necessarily always easy, but things that we all committed to 45 years ago. So let's move on to the next. I just wanted to sort of tease out really some of those really solid commitments that were in there. Also in the Helsinki Final Act, and stemming from it, we have three baskets of areas. I referred earlier briefly to the concept of comprehensive security that underpins the OSCE. In that spirit, we have sort of three pillars, if you, as it were, of engagement. So we've got the political military dimension of security, which can include things like border management, terrorism, trafficking, a range of issues under there. We've got we refer to that as the first dimension. We then have the second dimension, which is economic and environmental dimension. This it relates to cooperation with respect to economic issues, environmental issues. In many ways, this becomes increasingly important as climate change continues to be a threat. Water management issues are not something we think about as being an immediate threat to Canada most of the time. We're very lucky in that way. But in Europe, in the broader Europe region, where you have countries, sharing borders, sharing water supplies, etc., it's a very important thing. And having good water management, as an example, is an important conflict prevention tool. Science and technology, corruption issues, all of these things sort of fit into the economic and environmental basket. And then thirdly, we have the human dimension, which is sort of the core values that Canada, I think, represents in many organizations with respect to human rights and fundamental freedoms, democracy, rule of law. Also, we have humanitarian issues, which again links a little bit back to the first dimension around political military issues and conflict prevention. Media freedom, I've been saying that a lot today for some reason. Media freedom has been rolling off my tongue. Anyway, media freedom. Of course, today is World Press Day, and election monitoring. It's actually really important to mention election monitoring. Odihr is one of the autonomous institutions that exists under the in affiliation with the OSCE. Odihr is the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. And it really has one of the most widely esteemed, sort of highest caliber programs related to election monitoring in the world, really. So a lot of important work around election monitoring to support democracy. So that's sort of a sense of the breadth, I think, of the work of the OSCE. One other thing that's not explicitly on this slide for sort of complicated reasons that have to do with the structure of the OSCE, in parallel to these three dimensions, we also have a separate organization. So I mentioned earlier, the Permanent Council that meets every week. Also meeting every week is the Forum for Security Cooperation, which is there to support a number of confidence and security building measures related to conventional arms control that also fall within the OSCE. Or are closely linked to the OSCE, such as the Open Skies Treaty, which some of you may have heard of, The Vienna document, again, a document that has, it includes a number of confidence and security building and risk reduction measures, as well as the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, which is a little bit more, less active in the last 10 or more years. I'm happy to go into that a little bit if people have questions. Anyway, that's sort of it gives you a bit of a sense of the breadth of issues that that we deal with here at the OSCE. If we can maybe go on to the next slide. So the OSCE today. To fast forward a bit, as you're presumably all aware, the Soviet Union dissolved in 1990. There were also wars in the Western Balkans throughout the 1990s. We went over time gradually from 35 to 57 participating states. We also had a couple of states. We had a couple of new states join. We have had a couple of states that weren't originally, their territory wasn't originally covered, join along the way. Mongolia joined in 2012. The Holy See also joined in I believe that was in the 90s. But in the 90s, there were a number of sort of recommitments to these issues through and to these principles that were laid out in the Helsinki Final Act. We recommitted as states to those principles through a number of documents in the early 1990s. The Paris Charter for New Europe, the Copenhagen document. There's a number of, there was another Helsinki document in 1992. Anyway, I won't go into, let me get out of that rabbit hole before I go too far down it. But today, essentially, we have 57 participating states. The decisions are politically binding, not legally binding per se. So it is really a function of creating trust and confidence as part of the rules-based international order. Decisions here are also reached by consensus, which is different from many organizations. Certainly, I have actually worked in consensus-based decisions before coming here. Consensus-based organizations before coming here. It's a different dynamic than when you have voting, like you have at the UN, because not only do you have to, it's not just about building alliances and sort of spreading your, sharing with your colleagues the importance of your position or your way of looking at it. You basically need everybody on board. So the steps are very incremental and can be sometimes challenging to reach. In effect, every state in a consensus model, every state has a veto. Now, whether you just sort of throw that veto around and use it without, lightly with no concern, that's not necessarily the case. But effectively, it means that all of our decisions are much more incremental than you might see in other organizations. And then another thing just to remark on is that participating states set the agenda and maintain oversight. So the Secretariat is filled with highly expert people. The Secretary General, we have a new Secretary General who's just started in January. But the Secretary General, for example, doesn't have the same type of political role as the Secretary General of NATO might have, or as the Secretary General of the UN would have. She's responsible to the participating states, and it's a slightly different dynamic. One other thing that isn't highlighted in these slides, but I thought I would just mention briefly, is that there are these other autonomous institutions that are affiliated with the OSCE. So I mentioned Odihr, the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. There's also the representative on the freedom of, did it again, on the freedom of media, which is a smaller institution. It's about a couple dozen employees, but very active and important voice on media freedom issues. And then finally, we have the High Commissioner for National Minorities. National minorities is a concept that exists more in Europe, I would say, than in Canada. It's the idea that, so for example, you would have a Russian language national minority in some of the Baltic states, or there's a Hungarian minority that is in Ukraine. So how do those, how do those discussions there are on, how to ensure appropriate rights and freedoms for those national minorities. Canada, of course, we don't have national minority. I mean, we have very diverse, wonderfully diverse country, but we don't have national minorities per se. It's a very different concept from and situation from the Indigenous population we have in Canada, which are, of course, they are the first people of our country. So anyway, I thought I'd mention what those three other autonomous institutions are, and now we'll move on to the next slide. So just very quickly, an overview of the budget. The total budget of what we call the unified budget, or the UB, as well as the budget of the SMM, which is the Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, is a total of $367 million, not huge. Canada's contribution is about 5% of that, or just under $20 million. The unified budget, as with many organizations, has fixed contributions from each participating state according to a scale of assessments, which, as in many other organizations, is subject of lively debate every year or regularly. So approximately 30% of the budget is allocated to the Secretariat that sits in Vienna, and about 70% goes to the field missions. There are field missions that do critically important work all around the OSCE, the OSCE region. I think there are, I'm now drawing a blank, there are either well over a dozen field missions. Canada is the 6th largest contributor to the OSCE budget. On the SMM budget, this is specific since 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and attempted to annex it. The OSCE has had a special monitoring mission, specifically looking at the situation, across Ukraine. Their mandate is to cover all Ukrainian territory. There's a large focus, of course, on Donbass and in the eastern part of Ukraine. Canada was the 6th largest contributor to this, to the budget for the SMM, the Special Monitoring Mission, in 2020. And we contributed just over 5% of that, so about $8 million. We also have a number of Canadians who are seconded to the organization, which is, I think, really valuable and appreciated by Ukraine. And then, in addition to these two budgets, there's also extra budgetary projects, which are sort of like voluntary contributions, so to speak, and they would be with respect to specific projects in various areas. So let's move on to the next slide. This is just, I think this is kind of an interesting, I guess you would call it a Venn diagram, of sort of variation on a Venn diagram of who the participating states are. So the big red circle is the whole of the OSCE. Within that, you have all of the states who are part of the Council of Europe. You have all of the states that are part of NATO. And you have all of the states that are part of the EU, and as well as others that are part of none of those. So it's just it shows you a bit of the different groupings, where really, in addition to, of course, NATO partners, we also have what you might call our like-minded neutrals, who you can see kind of, I guess, in the beige circle on the outside. Oh, hold on, where's Switzerland on this? Anyway, they should be there. Oh, there they are. Yes, in the Council of Europe. So you've got your neutrals like Switzerland, Austria, Ireland, Finland, Sweden, Malta, and then you've got sort of broader countries across Europe and Central Asia. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting visualization. We can move on now to the next slide. So as I mentioned, as I went into earlier, we have the 3 dimensions, and across these 3 dimensions, we cover a wide range of security issues: arms control, conventional arms control, human rights, elections, economic and environmental activities, police training, cross-border cooperation. In recent years, border training and human trafficking issues have also become quite important as well. So that's just a selection of the issues we talk about. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to, there's a couple of slides here just talking about the missions and the field activities of the OSCE. 16, there you go. I was gonna say 16 field operations, but I didn't quite trust myself. So there are 16 field operations and 3,000 staff in the fields. They are highly decentralized. They're headed there's a head of mission for each field operation, and they have tailor-made or they have tailored mandates across the various dimensions to support the host country in whatever way, as a partner, in finding ways to make sure that the host country is able to fulfill its commitments under its OSCE commitments. So that's and really, I've only been here for 6 months, but the impression that I get, we actually have a Canadian who's been the head of mission in Uzbekistan for the last 4 years, and who's just, I think, recently taken on the head of mission for Turkmenistan. But talking to a few different heads of mission, I get, and a few different ambassador colleagues from the Canadian government, I get the impression that the resounding impression that the OSCE field missions are really seen as a really strong partner for the government, host governments, working together and helping them to be accountable to the commitments they've made. Next slide, please. So there we go, helping host states fulfill their OSCE commitments in areas such as early warning, conflict prevention, crisis management, post-conflict rehabilitation, facilitating the reforms and political processes, again, all in an effort to all in an effort to meet those OSCE commitments. Pardon me. And then the field missions report on an annual basis to the Permanent Council on the progress they've made, the programs that they're running, etc. Next slide, please. So this, I'm not sure how well if you can all see this well, but there's sort of regions of operations, very briefly. Southeastern Europe, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia are the main areas of the where we have field missions. And if we could just go to the next slide. Whoops. I think I've covered this. I think I've covered this already, so we can skip over to the next slide. Oh, one back. So here's sort of a full list of where those missions are. So we've got in most of the countries in the Western Balkans have one. So Bosnia, Montenegro, Kosovo. I would just note that Kosovo is not a member of the OSCE. There's an office in Albania, in Skopje, Macedonia, North Macedonia, apologies, in Serbia. Then we've got in Eastern Europe, we've got them in Moldova, Ukraine. We do not have one in Belarus. We've got one. We've got them in Central Asia, in each of the 5 Central Asian countries, and we've got one very precisely named mission on the conflict in the area dealt with by the OSCE Minsk Conference, which is a very deliberate and precise and long negotiated way of referring to the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. so between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And of course, you'll be aware that that conflict was that frozen conflict thawed out very quickly last fall, and with an unfortunate loss of many lives. One of the priorities here is trying to figure out how to move into a phase of post-conflict rehabilitation and etc. on that area. So that's just a quick overview of the areas where we have the OSCE has these field missions. If we can go to the next slide, please. What's in it for Canada? As I mentioned, we have daily and weekly meetings on dialogue. We have a comprehensive approach and if I can just drill down on that a little bit. Canada does not have diplomatic representation in all of these 57 or 56 other participating states. We're not a huge country. We can't be everywhere. It is a fantastic opportunity for me to be able to engage with my Central Asian counterparts here, to be able to engage with my counterparts in the Caucasus here, and to get their perspectives on the issues and the challenges that they're all facing. To be able to engage with my Belarusian counterpart, with my Moldovan counterpart, with my Georgian counterpart. Well, I covered South Caucasus, I believe, but these are countries that where Canada doesn't have on the ground representation because of funding limitations. We can't be everywhere all the time. So the OSCE really is a platform where we dialogue with all of these people on a regular basis, and we find areas where we can work together, even when there are sometimes areas where we don't always see eye to eye. And we talk about both. I think that's it for. I think I've made the rest of the points. As I've said a few times, it really is a question of looking at comprehensive security and engaging in dialogue on how these norms and principles that we've all signed up to are so critical. So with that, maybe we can end this part of the deck or presentation. And I thought I would just sort of maybe informally outline some of the priority areas for Canada. There's any number of issues that we can engage on here at the OSCE, and I have to say, for a very small delegation, we are quite active on many of them. I would say Ukraine since not just since 2014, but the situation since 2014 in Ukraine has been a critical priority for Canada. We discuss, this is a standing item, it's not a standing item, but it is raised every week at our permanent council meeting, as well as at the Forum for Security Cooperation meeting at the military advisor level. And we talk about the situation in Ukraine, and Canada is a fierce defender of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, the need to support the SMM in Donbass and throughout Ukraine, on the fact that Crimea remains part of Ukraine in Canada's view. This is really one of our top priorities. I think for a while it was sort of it was kind of the predominant priority on the political military. I don't mean priority, but also just the main issue on the political military. It still is, but unfortunately over the last year, we've also seen a number of other issues erupt in the Eastern European, in the European security space. I mentioned the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, obviously. That is no longer a live conflict, but there are a number of issues that still need to be resolved relating to demining, to prisoners of war being returned, the remains of those that were killed in action being returned. I mean, these are fundamental issues that need to move forward before, in order for any post-conflict rehabilitation and building of trust to take place. And it's a critical prerequisite that we are working on here. And of course, Belarus has been a big topic of conversation over the last year, over the last 8 months, I suppose, nine months now. I'll just mention on that, the OSCE was actually, one of the, I suppose you could call it a type of confidence and security building mechanism. I'm not sure that we normally, it's not exactly a security mechanism per se, but we have something here that's called the Moscow mechanism that was agreed in Moscow in the early 1990s, which allows any participating state to invoke it and ask for a third-party investigator to research and investigate what is going on in the territory of another participating state and to make recommendations. We, together with 16 other participating states, invoked that mechanism last September, following the election, the fraudulent election results that came out in Belarus, and the egregious crackdown that immediately became apparent against people who were protesting. And who continue bravely and courageously to protest to this day, despite phenomenally bad circumstances and unacceptable circumstances there. But that Moscow mechanism, there was a rapporteur who was identified, came in, looked at, it did all of this online because he wasn't permitted access to the country. And was able to gather a great deal of evidence and testimonials about what was going on in Belarus. I think that was absolutely critical and has created a really good repository of evidence, good repository of very bad evidence about what's going on. And and he came up with, I think there were 80, a little over 80 different recommendations. Some to the international community at large, some to OSCE participating states, a good number, I think about 60, 64 or something, to the Belarusian government. Very concrete actions that should be taken, and Canada has acted on virtually all of them that we can so far, or either has acted, as in the action is completed, or we're doing it on an ongoing basis. So that's obviously taken up a lot of airspace here, rightfully so. There are other enduring conflicts, frozen in Georgia, Moldova, that continue to be a concern for us. This is the organization where those are discussed. I mentioned earlier the Open Skies Treaty. That's another one that's taking up a lot of attention. As many of you will be aware, the U.S. withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty in May of 2020, finalized in November of 2020. Russia has now indicated publicly that they intend to withdraw, although they have not yet. Canada is actually one of the co-depositories of the treaty, together with Hungary, from when it was founded back in the early 1990s. And so when a state withdraws from the treaty, we have to convene a conference of states parties as part of the formalities for that. Coincidentally, Canada is also the chair. I'm chairing the OSCE, the implementing body, the Commission for the Open Skies Treaty, from now until August. So another one that's definitely front and center on our radar. And of course, promoting human rights, freedom of peaceful assembly, media freedom, freedom of expression, gender equality, LGBTI issues, freedom of religion and belief, tolerance and non-discrimination, which is the slightly not quite as progressive version of way of saying diversity and inclusion, which is, of course, Canada's maybe a little bit a step beyond tolerance and discrimination in our aspirations, at least. And of course, democracy and rule of law. So as you can see, many of the organization's priorities align very much with Canadian priorities. I think maybe I will leave it there, other than just to say maybe a brief word about the partnerships that we work with here. Of course, we work with our NATO caucus, the NATO countries that are which are all members of the OSCE. We also work in smaller groups We work closely with the US and the UK. We're part of something called the Like-Minded Group at the OSCE, which is Canada, Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. So small countries that sort of, but who all share, I think, a number of common values. So we align sometimes on specific issues. As I mentioned earlier, it's also a great opportunity I've found to engage with countries where Canada doesn't always have a presence on the ground. I have been fascinated to my courtesy calls last fall on my Central Asian counterparts really opened up a whole interesting world of the issues they face. But also I engage regularly with my Belarusian counterpart, with my Ukrainian counterpart, my Georgian counterpart. I don't actually have a Moldovan counterpart right now because they haven't appointed a head of mission. And then, as I mentioned, the Holy See is another state that we engage with on a regular basis as well. So maybe I'll leave it at that and open it up to questions. Sorry, I may have spoken a little longer than intended, but hopefully it was interesting and relevant.
No need to apologize, Ambassador. Speaking for myself personally, I didn't know much about the OSCE. I knew of it, but I didn't know extensively the inner workings of it. And I honestly really appreciate you going in detail in terms of what exactly the functionality and the purpose of the OSCE is. So thank you so much for that. And just thank you so much for all those wonderful remarks. It's very informative and very helpful for us as we sort of study and promote international security. We'll turn to one or two moderated questions before turning over to our live audience. So live audience, we encourage you to please get your questions in, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. To start though, I want to ask a question relating to sort of bilateral relationships and multilateralism. So a cornerstone of the OSCE is a commitment to bilateralism and multilateralism and the ability to peacefully settle disputes. Mm-hmm. In the last month, though, we saw a rise in tensions between two OSCE member states, that being Russia and Ukraine. What is the OSCE's approach to tackle these developments, and where does Canada come into play, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question, and very, very topical, of course. The OSCE, so I mentioned at one point in my remarks some of the conventional arms control mechanisms that exist at the OSCE. One of those is the Vienna document, which is supposed to be modernized every 5 years. The last time it was successfully modernized was 2011. Has not been modernized since then. Largely, my understanding is that there's some hesitation on Russia has not engaged on this issue. However, it is still there as a tool and has a number of elements in it that can help with risk reduction. And Ukraine invoked the Vienna document in the beginning of April over Easter, when they saw this rise in the military buildup that was taking place. And essentially the article that they invoked under the Vienna document was Article 16, which allows any participating state to ask another participating state to please explain some sort of military activity that and to create some transparency around the intent, duration, etc. of something that's going on. So Ukraine asked for that information. I think they weren't. If they're not satisfied with the response they receive, they then have the option to call a meeting bilaterally with that country and invite other countries. So Ukraine did that then as well. And the purpose of that is sort of to ask them to explain sort of in person. Russia did not choose, and Ukraine opened it to all participating states. All participating states were able to join this meeting. Russia did not choose to participate. Ukraine then had another meeting. There's sort of 3 steps in this particular risk reduction mechanism. So they called the third meeting or they requested the third meeting. And at that one, Russia did participate, albeit at a very low level. They had, rather than, it was most countries had their ambassadors participating, and Russia sent an advisor, a woman. The first time I've actually ever seen a woman on the Russian delegation, but it was good. It's good to know they have women diplomats. She was very good, but did not really engage in answering the questions that Ukraine had, and insisted that the particular activities that were going on did not fall within the Vienna document. So they were basically disputing the applicability of the Vienna document to the particular situation, which was unfortunate. At the same time, I was glad to see that they at least participated in the meeting. Instead, what we heard a couple of weeks later was, through Twitter, we found out that the Russians were planning to draw down. Obviously Canada is, and others are going to watch that situation closely, because we still don't have a lot of detail on, are they drawing down to what the situation was 2 months ago? That hasn't been clarified, that hasn't been stated explicitly. So the Vienna document is there to allow that type of information to be communicated. Unfortunately, Russia has not engaged in that communication or that level of transparency. They've just, they've sort of sent out a tweet, and of course, we're all relieved to know that it's going in that direction, rather than going and continuing in the same direction it was. But obviously, we're watching it closely.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I mean, just as you mentioned, the fact that Russia was at least a part of, this risk reduction mechanism speaks to its importance, certainly. And I believe one of the things that you also mentioned earlier, quite appropriately, was the distinction between, organizations like the OSCE and like the United Nations. So the OSCE is, of course, a regional organization that promotes peace. In that regard, could you speak to perhaps the unique challenges that a regional organization or alliance like NATO might face as compared to a global organization like the UN?
Sorry, just to make sure I understood your question, basically a compare and contrast a global organization like the UN versus something like NATO or the OSCE.
Yes, regional.
Okay. I think I might answer your question more specifically than, I think I'm not going to group NATO and OSCE together, if that's okay. Certainly, I mean, it's quite interesting. Yeah, so NATO, I think, obviously, I think there can be differences of opinion among NATO member states, but ultimately, there's a fundamental commitment to the principles. I think, unfortunately, what we've seen at the OSCE, at least from Canada's perspective, it seems that the commitment to the OSCE principles that was made in 1975 at the height of the Cold War, somehow we were able to make that commitment in 1975, and we are not able to demonstrate that commitment in 2021. We have obviously the invasion of Crimea is a massive violation of at least half of, probably possibly all of the principles of the Helsinki Decalogue. And so I guess I would sort of contrast NATO, where everybody's kind of rowing in the same direction, versus the OSCE, where we're not rowing in. We've committed to the same principles, where we're not always rowing in the same direction. But it is important that we are at least sitting at the table and talking about it, because it doesn't. Because dialogue is critical. I really do believe that. I'll also just say one of the, I mean, there's so many unfortunate impacts of COVID, but one of them is that I think it really does in some ways hollow out multilateralism. I've used the analogy, so I arrived here in October. my first permanent council was the last one that was conducted in hybrid format before everything went online. Our meetings, often feel like we're making statements, we're talking at each other through a screen, but those so the skeleton, the skeletal structure of the OSCE is still working, but unfortunately, the flesh, the organs, all the pieces, the connective tissue that holds it together, because you can grab a coffee with somebody outside, or have a quick conversation in the corner, or just build that personal rapport, is not there. And it really, I think it's unfortunately exacerbating some of the, or risks exacerbating some of the negative tendencies that we're seeing. It doesn't allow personal connections to kind of knit together some of the gaps and some of the differences in opinion. In terms of your question about, so I've answered two questions that you didn't have. But in terms of your question about the UN, like a global organization versus a regional organization, I think what happens is that a lot of the issues that really are quite urgent and pressing, such as Belarus and Nagorno-Karabakh, are really, and Ukraine, are really allowed to, you can really get into them at a much deeper level in a regional organization. I think there really is, in a global organization, there are just so many conflicts, unfortunately, to competing for the finite attention and time that the organization has, that you can't really, it's harder to really delve deeply into those more regional conflicts. Whereas when we're sitting here at the OSCE and we're talking about our European security space, which, as you saw from the map at the beginning, really does span like almost, the northern third of the globe, at least, or northern 40% of the globe. But they're all issues that I think the regional focus allows us to delve into them quite a bit more. So you saw that, I think, in the way that the OSCE has come up with a response. The special monitoring mission in Ukraine, you saw that with the invocation of the Moscow mechanism in Belarus. You saw that, I think, with, well, unfortunately, the Nagorno-Karabakh, the OSCE has been working on solving that issue for 30 years, and it's still no further along. I don't mean it's no further along. Incremental progress, tiny bits of progress have been made, mostly unseen, I have to say. But the attention that it has received and the resources that have been put forward towards it have been mostly through the OSCE. So anyway, I'm not sure if that satisfactorily answers your question, but there you go. Partly answered your question and answered two other questions that you didn't ask as well.
That's even better.
And with that, Ambassador, we'll bring our moderated discussion to a close. And I'm conscious of the time. I was wondering if what your sort of time commitments are, if you were willing to go a few minutes over the hour. Not perfect, because we have a bunch of really good, insightful questions from the audience that we were hoping to get to at this point.
Okay.
So one of the first questions that we have from the audience, I'll ask two in a row just so we can get to as many as possible, and you can answer as in-depthly as you like. You mentioned earlier in presentation that Kosovo actually isn't a member of the OSCE, and I was wondering if you could speak to why that is. And another question from the audience is, from 2018, Canada has largely withdrawn from sending observers on OSCE and ODIHR election missions, except Ukraine. What is the rationale behind this decision, and will Canada resume participation?
Okay, interesting. On the Kosovo, issue, I think the reason that it's not a member relates directly to the reason or the fact that certain states have recognized its status as a state, and others have not. And the others that have not include a number of OSCE participating states. Serbia is, of course, one of them, Russia another, but there are others as well that haven't. So that's essentially that. As I said, it's a consensus-based organization. Everybody needs to agree. So that's why Kosovo is not a participating state. Although I have to, I have to say that issue in and of itself has not come up in my time here, but that's my understanding. With respect to Canada, I have to confess I was not aware that Canada had made a decision to stop sending election observers to Odihr. On Odihr missions. I know we have been more active. I think not just in the last 2 years, probably in the last 15 plus years that I've been in government. I know we tend to have a more robust presence. We've been very engaged on Ukrainian election monitoring for many, many years. But I wasn't aware of that decision. But I will look into it and find out. But I can't really speak to that. Sorry.
Thank you for your responses on those questions, Ambassador. I have two more here. The first one being, does the Canadian delegation, according to you, invest in structured dialogue? And do you envision it taking a more dynamic role in the future? And the second one being, how does the OSCE specifically address issues of cyber arms control, the use of cyber attacks specifically, when they're conducted against nation states?
Okay, so structured dialogue and cyber. So the structured dialogue, for those who don't know, is an initiative that's been going on for the last few years on sort of the future of arms control. And it is, we participate, we engage actively. I actually sat down with the chair. Gosh, time is flying so quickly. But back in March, before he kicked on, Spain is chairing the structured dialogue right now. So as he was developing his agenda, etc., I sat down and engaged with him and sort of gave him Canada's views on priority areas, etc. And the structured dialogue is by and large carried out at the military advisor or Paul Mill expert level. Certainly Canada does engage. We definitely see a value in dialogue, having a dialogue on these issues. At the same time, we do not, we think it's very important to uphold the commitments that already exist, that participating states have committed to. So in our view, I think the structured dialogue can be helpful insofar as it looks at emerging threats that aren't covered by the conventional arms commitments that already exist. And it could potentially result in, as the dialogue evolves and sort of bears fruit, could result in commitments to complement the existing commitments that participating states have made on conventional arms control. On the second question on cyber attacks, I'm not sure that I got all the details of the question, but there is, and I'm not actually, with 6 months in, I can't say that I can answer that question in great detail, but I do know there is a mechanism for notification of participating states of cyber attacks. It was used by a participating state recently to notify of a cyber attack. We also have a cyber informal working group, which is fairly active, that is working to sort of lay down not just principles, but sort of working measures. There are a number of confidence building measures that are in place under the cyber working group. And Canada is actually leading on one of those. We're co-leading together with Kazakhstan. on sort of laying down the principles of cyber security, cyber cooperation, and they you know, I mean, the principles exist, which are sort of a, I'm going to get, I hope I get the words right here, but a free, sorry, an open, secure, and interoperable internet. I might have gotten one of those wrong, but generally there's some principles, and Canada and Kazakhstan are working together to try and lay out for all participating states, you know, what exactly do those terms, how do we define those terms, and how can, let's agree on what exactly they mean in practice.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think as we do move into like the digital age, and we already are in it, it is really important so how we deal with these sort of cyber security and cybersecurity threats. So thank you very much for those comments. As a final question for our discussion today, you mentioned you started to talk about this briefly, I think back in one of your answers or during your presentation, but how was Russian annexation of Crimea handled by the OSCE, given that it was obviously violated the Helsinki Accord? So how did the OSCE handle those events at that time?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And sorry, I just want one other thing I wanted to mention on cyber. It just so happens we actually have there's an annual cyber conference which is going on tomorrow and the next day at the OSCE. So sorry, just to definitely an area that we're looking at, and of course, you know, disinformation cuts across all three dimensions. Hybrid warfare is another related issue. So definitely a hot button issue, and one that gets a lot of attention here. Sorry, so with respect to your question on Crimea, I was not here at the time, but when Ukraine invoked the Vienna document risk reduction mechanism a few weeks ago, I guess almost a month ago now, that was an opportunity to take a bit of a look at what had been done back in 2014. And the Vienna document was invoked, different measures under it were invoked about, sorry, I'm now going to confuse my numbers, but well over a dozen times, between 1 and 2 dozen different invocations of various measures of the Vienna document. And again, those were intended to increase dialogue, increase transparency. What is the intent? Fundamentally, one of the sort of unfortunate things is you need to have the cooperation of all states to make these mechanisms work effectively. I do suspect, in retrospect, that using these mechanisms, which involved not only calling meetings and asking questions, but also voluntary visits, observation missions, and other mechanisms, I think they probably did help to lower the temperature somewhat. Obviously, though, the final outcome in terms of the lightning fast annexation, illegal annexation of Crimea, as well as the protracted conflict and fighting that went on in eastern Ukraine, you know, was a tragic consequence of Russia's aggression, and it continues in many ways to this day, obviously. So what was the OSCE's response? It used the mechanisms, the risk reduction, confidence building mechanisms available. Obviously, those types of mechanisms are stretched to their absolute limit when you have a situation of full-on aggression. So again, this is an organization for dialogue. It tried to use dialogue as much as it could to reduce tensions, reduce the tenseness of the situation. But ultimately, it's not a peacekeeping organization. Actually, in theory, it could potentially have scope I've heard to do something along those lines, but the SMM that resulted is really the most robust mission of that sort, and it's not a peacekeeping mission; it's an observation mission, it's a monitoring mission. It is not a hard military power organization. It is a confidence and security building organization. So ultimately, I would say the outcome was the SMM, Special Monitoring Mission, that has been monitoring the ceasefire. The Trilateral Contact Group, which includes sort of, well, there's dispute by Russia over who exactly is a party to the Trilateral Contact Group, but it includes Ukraine, Luhansk, the sort of provisional governments, armed formations of Luhansk and Donetsk, and Russia, sort of sitting down to try and talk through political issues, security issues, humanitarian issues. So the peace building mechanisms, or the confidence building mechanisms that are in place, that have been in place for the last 7 years, are primarily, there's also the Normandy 4, which is a bit separate, but are primarily from the OSCE. So, and of course, the Normandy 4 is critical. I certainly didn't mean to sort of just explain it as being separate and not to think about. It's obviously a very important one as well, but and works closely with the Trilateral Contact Group. So anyway,
thank you so much, Ambassador, for your extensive comments on that question. That was from our chair, the Honourable David Collinette. And as you mentioned, dialogue is the very centerpiece of diplomacy. So in that regard, looks like that's all we have time for. So we'd like to convey our sincerest thanks to you from the NATO Association for agreeing to have this conversation and for your thoughtful and insightful comments. With that, I will now pass it on to our President, Robert Baines.
Thanks so much, Edwette. And Ambassador, it's been a real pleasure. The one thing that has come through loud and clear is that, of course, not only is the international rules-based order itself a nexus or a network, but even the institutions within it have an almost dizzying amount of organs and entities that are crisscrossing and helping to make more resilience. I mean, it does often sound almost maddeningly confusing, but these things help to give us those extra little areas for dialogue that you were mentioning. And I loved your discussion about how some of those things have dropped away because we're not able to meet in person as much. But I think that the human element is really what thrives in the rules-based international order. It's that whole idea of the non-zero sum collaborative endeavor to make sure that we can work together towards security. And I salute you for all of your work and your team at the OSCE. We hope to have another chance to talk with you soon. And I would also like to say thank you to Eric Jackson and Edwette Sharma for doing such a great job of moderating our questions. With that, again, please remember to keep in touch, and the conversation never ends. We will continue to discuss weekly on Zoom and through our social media elements. So thanks so much, everybody, and have a lovely day.